right, hello History 362 and 363. I thought it would be appropriate to do another kind of joint lecture because I'm talking about a topic that's really relevant for both classes, namely thinking about the human ecology and the basic economy of the Mediterranean. And that's going to be relevant whether we're talking about Roman Italy, the Western Mediterranean, or the Aegean and Hellenistic worlds. I actually am using the term human ecology because I don't just want to talk about sort of the economy more narrowly, what we might think of, just sort of general production, consumption, exchange. We'll be talking about those things. But to also think about how all of those processes were deeply embedded in the environment. And this is particularly important because of the centrality of agriculture to all ancient Mediterranean societies, but truly all pre-modern societies. Now, of course, obviously agriculture is tremendously important to us today because we need to eat, but the percentage of population involved in agriculture is quite small. Less than 2% of the population in the United States is involved in agriculture. A lot of the work is done by machines and in sort of vast industrial processes. Now, in the ancient Mediterranean, and really in the pre-modern world more generally, a vast proportion of the total population is directly involved in agricultural production. Again, we don't have exact figures, but 90% would be a pretty fair estimate of those involved directly in agriculture, which means the entire economy, really the totality of the economy, is much more rooted in the environment than our kind of industrial or post-industrial economy, where because of technologies and industrial production, we were not as beholden to the immediate vagaries of the natural world. Now, I'm going to be actually drawing heavily on really kind of one of the most influential books of the last generation, Peregrine, Horden, and Nicholas Purcell's The Corrupting Sea. And they really argue that the Mediterranean in particular has a very unique human ecology, that the way that humans interact with the Mediterranean environment is actually very different even compared to, say, other parts of continental Europe or Asia. And this has a lot to do with the Mediterranean's uniquely fragmented geology. I think I may have said this at least in one of the courses earlier on, but the geology of the Mediterranean is truly a dog's breakfast. Essentially, there's about 3 different continents that have been smashed up on top of each other. This produces some of the kind of ethereal geologic features that, say, tourists like to go to. But the landscape itself is profoundly fragmented. There's lots of mountains, and mountainous terrain tends to divide agricultural areas up, and also sort of creates micro ecologies with their own kind of microclimates. And this is actually very, very important, that this ecological climatic fragmentation actually sort of drives how economic processes work. So first off, one thing about the Mediterranean broadly, it is relatively arid. It's not like, say, us here in the northeast United States, where it's raining all the damn time, including basically right now as I'm recording this lecture. The Mediterranean has a climate that is much more akin to, say, coastal California, which I sometimes describe as having a Mediterranean climate. It does rain, but nonetheless it has very hot, dry summers in addition to rainier winters. And so this general aridity means that a lot of the land in the Mediterranean is in fact relatively marginal for agriculture. You can grow crops, but the chance of a crop failure in any given year is high. So that's one key thing. We have microregions and sort of microclimates. But for almost all of the microregions, the agricultural possibilities are somewhat marginal. And this is important because that means the chance that a microregion suffers crop failure is reasonable. Now, one thing about these microregions with microclimates is it is quite possible for one region to suffer adverse climatic realities and therefore agricultural failure, while other relatively nearby regions are unaffected in that the fact that it could rain in your little plain, but your neighbors are suffering from drought or vice versa is actually pretty high. And this actually becomes even more true as you sort of go across the Mediterranean. So for Horden and Purcell, they said the fact that you have this fragmentation of a marginal environment with therefore sort of variegated outcomes, it really encourages people to exchange. Because you may not be having a great year, therefore you may need to import food from a nearby region. But equally, the next year you be having a bumper crop that just happened to rain in your plain, but you may need to export it to a region that's suffering from drought or crop failure. So therefore, trade is a really vital not just at kind of the macro level, but at a base subsistence level. Oftentimes you need to trade to eat. There's also going to be a real strong incentive to store all you can. Because you may have a great crop this year, less good crop next year, so you actually will try to put away as much food as you can, which as the situation changes, you either have a surplus that you can trade away, or if you're having a really bad year, you can just dip into your surplus simply to survive. This need to have agricultural staples that are both easy to exchange and move over relatively long distances, and also agricultural staples that store really well, to a degree explains why we come to our Mediterranean triad, the three most important crops that are grown in the Mediterranean. Now, of course, one of the reasons these crops are grown is they grow well in kind of somewhat arid, warm environments. So wheat, grapes, and olive oil. It's the Mediterranean triad. Now, they are also very good crops because they do provide for sort of human necessities. So wheat, of all of the sort of domesticated cereals, has some of the highest protein content. Including why, say, people suffering from celiac disease can't eat wheat. It's just got lots and lots of gluten, even the lower gluten wheats that are being grown in antiquity. So in terms of a grain that provides not just carbohydrates but also protein, wheat's up there. You can subsist on just wheat better than, say, just rice or just corn. Olive oil, also, it's obviously a main source of fat. A really good source of vitamin E. And olive oil also has some sort of additional uses. It can be your soap. Soap is invented up by the Gauls in continental Europe. It seems to be working, in existence in the late Hellenistic period or late Roman Republic. But by and large, if you want to take a bath in the ancient world, you might bathe. And then what you might do is actually anoint yourself in olive oil. And then scrape off the mixture of olive oil and skin, and that's part of your, say, hygiene routine. So olive oil sort of is your soap. Also a key source of fuel for lamps. So if people are burning lamps to see at night, they're primarily burning olive oil lamps. So olive oil therefore has uses beyond food, but olives are a quintessential Mediterranean crop, and indeed, some definitions of the Mediterranean, including ancient definitions, sort of the Mediterranean kind of ends where the ability to grow olive trees ends. Finally, grapes. They are a small amount of grapes are either eaten or turned into raisins. The basic use for grapes is to make wine. Now, important for all of these. And actually, let me just one comment on wine. We should actually remember, as I'm sitting here drinking a cup of coffee, in our modern world, we are stimulants and sort of luxuries abound. Coffee, sugar, chocolate, tobacco, stronger things. Really, none of these things really exist in the ancient world. Coffee certainly doesn't exist. Sugar, not really, other than a very small amount of honey that is used as a sweetener. Tobacco, New World crop. So really, the kind of one thing that you can do to sort of have a kind of psychotropic experience is to drink alcohol. And by and large, the primary use of primary alcohol comes in the form of wine. Although beer, fermented wheat beverages, or barley beverages, fermented grains are drunk in both Egypt and also again in continental Europe, particularly what's now the kind of Celtic region. That they would be more likely to drink beers made from fermented grain versus wine in the Mediterranean. Now, all three of these crops, the Mediterranean Triad, wheat, wine, olives, all of them are very easy to both store for long periods of time. Wheat doesn't store forever; it can spoil, but you can store wheat for several years if you have it under appropriate conditions. Wine, obviously, grapes don't keep, but once you turn it into wine, wine can keep for many years, and even after it spoils, turns into vinegar, which is also drunk as a beverage. Indeed, drinking kind of spoiled wine or wine that's kind of half wine, half vinegar is a very common sort of working man's drink or soldier's drink to get you through the day. This is actually what they're drinking. Soldiers are drinking at the crucifixion. Posca or oxus. It's a kind of wine blending into vinegar. The important thing is it keeps around for a long time, so you get the benefit of that crop. Likewise, olives, once you press them, that olive oil can keep for a long period of time. So this is important. Not only do these crops just grow well, but these are deliberately crops that are all very easy to store for long periods of time. So you have a bumper year, you put it in your cellar, and it can get you through the next year if it's a lean year. Also crops that are very easy to redistribute. If someone else is having a terrible year and they're like, hey, we'll give you lots of money, you can start moving large quantities of wheat, olive oil, and wine much more easily than other commodities. The Mediterranean Triad is therefore in some ways kind of a response to sort of the basic kind of ecological realities of the Mediterranean: fragmented geography, marginal lands, and highly varied climate, varied and unpredictable climates. This also means that you are likely to or have an economy that is very heavily oriented towards not just production and consumption, but exchange. And that exchange, again, is both low-level exchange, and indeed a lot of this kind of, for Horden and Purcell, a lot of the exchange mandated by the fragmentation is very much the exchange not of sort of big, huge ships, but rather of small kind of cabotteurs, small traders loading up a riverboat, moving things tens to hundreds of miles versus ocean-going ships moving hundreds to thousands of miles. Now, one other key feature about the Mediterranean, we have this fragmented climate, is, of course, the ocean, the Mediterranean Sea. It is the sea. That's why Horden and Purcell entitled their book The Corrupting Sea. Namely that you have all of this fragmented geography, but importantly, it is linked together by the superhighway that is the Mediterranean Sea. And I think I've stressed this briefly in some other lectures. But one other reality about really just thinking about the pre-modern world is the extraordinary cost and difficulty of communication. And again, it's something that's hard for us to get our heads around when we can so easily hop in a car, catch a flight, get on an Amtrak. It's actually quite, you can literally go to the Albany airport, step onto a plane, and 6 hours later be on the West Coast, be 3,000 miles away. communications and transportation is incredibly expensive and difficult in the pre-modern world. But it is much, much more cheaper to go by water than to go by land. Land transport, moving any amount of goods by land, is extraordinarily expensive when you're basically moving it with either, usually with some kind of beast of burden, say pulling a wagon or a mule train, in some instances just having somebody carry it. And indeed, we have a sense of how these cost differentials worked through Diocletian's price edict. So this is a piece of evidence that comes from the late Roman period, when the Roman Emperor Diocletian is trying to crack down on runaway inflation. His solution probably doesn't work very well, but he just says, well, I'm just going to make a mandatory price edict, and you don't follow it, I'll torture you to death. Now, the nice thing about this price edict is the prices are not expressed always in absolute terms, but are expressed in ratios, ratios based around the cost of a unit of wheat. And this is very useful because even though, okay, the price edict failed, these ratios were probably somewhat rooted in reality, because Diocletian actually wanted to produce prices that would be workable. And the ratios that we have for movement by land and river transport and sea are 1:6:59. So what that means is it costs 6 times as much to move a unit of goods a distance by sea on a riverboat. So your costs go up 6-fold once to move a mile by ocean. It's 6 times more expensive to move a mile on a river. And remember, if you're on a river, you may at times actually be having a mule sort of tow you up a river, and there's more costs associated with moving a smaller boat up a river. But it's 59 more times expensive to move that set of goods by land. So what this means is it may be as expensive to move a unit of goods 50 miles by wagon as it is to move those units of goods all the way across the Mediterranean from the Levant to the Pillars of Hercules, if that ratio ultimately holds. And again, that makes sense. You can put so much more stuff on a large ocean-going boat. There's fewer crew. And of course, once you start moving things by land, you actually have to feed the darn animals of fodder simply to get them to continue to move forward, in addition to paying whoever's driving them to move forward over a relatively, possibly several days. So what that means is land transport is incredibly expensive. Riverine transport is still relatively expensive. Sea transport is relatively cheap. Fortunately, if you live in the Mediterranean, the sea is everywhere. And so therefore, communities that are economically productive tend to be heavily oriented towards the sea. They're either on the sea directly, or like Rome and Antioch, they are so Alexandria would be a good case of a community that's directly on the sea. The famous lighthouse of Alexandria, and of course is just the economic as well as the political and cultural center of Egypt. Rome or Antioch would be good cases of cities, very prosperous, powerful, important cities that are a little ways inland, but on a river that leads to the sea. So you've got relatively cheap riverine transport that then turns into super cheap sea transport. It also means that islands are actually some of the most connected places in the Mediterranean. We think of islands as lonely and desolate, but islands, because they're tied into this very cheap form of transportation, the sea, are actually economic hubs. And so Rhodes in the Hellenistic world is a really good example of course, Rhodes is a city that has its own navy, but it has its own navy to protect the huge amount of trade that flows through Rhodes as a waypoint on this kind of, blue super highway. So at any rate, I think actually I'm going to end it there. We can obviously talk endlessly about the economy. Actually, no, I want to say one more thing. One thing about the economy is, and this is actually something that ancient historians of the economy are still debating to this day, did it grow? Our sort of whole political system is predicated on the idea of at least somewhat steady economic growth. Stagnation is seen as a very bad thing, just treading water. One view, sort of the traditional view that was dominated in the 1970s by a famous historian named Moses Finley. He was a Marxist historian, in fact, left the United States because of his communist views. Finley felt that the ancient economy was essentially stagnant. He sort of would look at the overall kind of growth curve in the ancient world as steady, 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 and then there's the only time that there's really economic growth in the big, long arc of human history is when we start hitting the modern era and industrialization. Recently, there have been a number of ancient economic historians who are somewhat more bullish on the ancient economy. They point to, during the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, a rise in urbanization. And this is true in both the Roman world and the Hellenistic world. More cities, sometimes prompted by state-level enterprises, Roman colonization, city-building processes sponsored by Hellenistic kings, particularly the Seleucids. And urbanization generally is a kind of sign of economic growth. The fact that you've actually got more people engaging in non-agricultural economic pursuits. Another sort of possible metric that points towards economic growth in the 3rd and 2nd centuries is shipwrecks. We can date shipwrecks archaeologically. And overall, it seems that there is a steady increase in the number of shipwrecks over the course of the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, and peaking in what will eventually be the really Augustan age, late Roman Republic and the Augustan age. But even so, there's a clear trend in the 200s and 100s BC. Now, a question, if there is economic growth, what's driving it? Some folks see state policy, and here the state policy that may be the most decisive is the Roman conquest of the Mediterranean, creating a kind of more open economic structure. I should say the Romans aren't really doing this intentionally, but they may be unintentionally by eliminating a lot of the previous state barriers towards the movement of goods, are creating a more open economic structure. Another possibility, and I'll leave this as an intriguing possibility, there is some evidence that there is a slight climatic shift, a bit of global warming, not the potentially catastrophic global warming that we are facing, but that the Mediterranean world is somewhat warmer around the 2nd century, starting around 200 BC, than it had been. Again, if it's happening, it's happening for natural reasons, not as a result of anthropogenic climate change. And it may be slightly warmer in a kind of beneficial way. We're getting rapidly warmer in a highly detrimental way, but slightly warmer to the Mediterranean might mean more heat, means more humidity, means more rain, and in a kind of marginal environment for many places in the Mediterranean, that could be an overall plus. And this, again, we're starting to kind of try to integrate climate into our history of the ancient world. Suffice it to say, some people start speaking of a new kind of historical climatic phase around 200 BC called the Roman climate optimum. And if this is the case, and again, this is still being debated and argued, but if it is the case, that might also explain why we start seeing a real uptick in economic activity, simply because the environmental factors have also become much more conducive to productivity, particularly in a pre-modern world, still profoundly rooted in agricultural production. All right, that's all for today. I will drop some more videos later this week, probably unique to each class. I'll see you all soon.